Okay, we're gonna get started. Welcome everyone to our seventh roundtable on shelter and homelessness for the Boston area, roundtable through the BSA, Boston Society of Architects. Tonight we have with us this evening Joyce Tavon, Chief Executive Officer for Massachusetts Housing and Shelter Alliance. Thank you for joining us, and we appreciate the time that you're giving to this. And she's going to be going, and I'm Juan Corey, chair of this committee. And then trying to move, oops, sorry. And today Joyce will be talking about several things and different things of her organization, their work, and what they've been doing in the past 2 years. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Joyce to start.
All right. Yeah, thank you. And hello, everyone. Good evening. So I think what I was going to do is talk a little about both my organization and a little about the broader context of the current, crisis of homelessness and supportive housing and some of the work we're doing in that end. So I'm going to share my screen. I will run through slides. We're a small enough group. At any point, feel free to kind of just start jumping in, asking questions. It would be nice for this to be more of a conversation discussion rather than just me talking at you. All right, so to that end, all right, so MHSA and solutions to homelessness. So first off, the current crisis of homelessness. Sad to say, homelessness is rising in the US and in the state. Kind of a couple of data points related to this. Every year at this time of year, in fact, tomorrow night is a count in Boston. There's this homeless census count. And last year at this time, 19,000 people were counted in our state. That's women, men, children. Of that group, roughly 6,200 were adult individuals, so not with children, and 1,300 of them were unsheltered. People may be quite aware, if you've been following the news, that we have a migrant humanitarian crisis. It's really, a broad global humanitarian crisis that is very much hitting here in Massachusetts. Just briefly, you may be aware, we are a state that has, quote, a right to shelter. We're the only state that has that. That right to shelter is only for families. So if you are an adult on your own without children, there is no right to shelter. And given our own homegrown housing crisis and homelessness being on the rise, shelters for adults are full or over capacity. And sadly, we are seeing a rise in tent encampments. Another phenomenon we all are aware probably of what's happening, this demographic trend, the aging of the overall population. So that, of course, is hitting people who are particularly vulnerable as well. And an emerging and disturbing trend is first-time homeless older adults. I've never been homeless before. Then you throw into the mix, people are probably quite aware, there's a drug epidemic, frayed, really broken mental health system, the lack of other systems of care. So you have all that going on, but really at its root, homelessness is a housing problem. Homelessness is highest in places where housing is costly and scarce. And as you all probably know, as architects, production has not kept pace in our state over the last 20 years. And the governor has been talking about that quite a bit. Good news, we've had a booming economy compared to many places in the country, but production of housing hasn't kept pace. So here we are, lowest vacancy rental rate in the country, average fair market rent, for a one bedroom in Greater Boston, 2,300. So that's kind of the background to all of this. A little on who we are, Massachusetts Housing and Shelter Alliance, or MHSA. So we founded in 1988, we're a statewide advocacy and policy organization dedicated to ending homelessness. We work in partnership with 100 member organizations and other advocacy groups and city state policymakers. Our focus is how do we understand we need to kind of address this immediate crisis, but how, as much as possible, do we shift out of just kind of emergency responses and just adding more and more shelter and focus on solutions. And of course, housing is at the heart of that. And I'm going to touch on what does housing first mean. And then let me just, oops, switching between two screens. So, and our focus, our concern is homelessness overall. All our particular focus and attention is on adult individuals who, as I said, don't have a right to shelter, and especially those who've been cycling in and out of homelessness a long time, may have other kind of complex medical issues, addictions, mental illness, often referred to as folks who are chronically homeless, maybe remaining in shelter and long time, and as I mentioned about growing encampments. I want to touch on, we can have more discussion, just but what when we use terminology. So we use the terminology supportive housing or permanent supportive housing. So what does that mean? So a few things across the board. It's in our world, that's the housing targeted to that very complex population. Everyone needs housing. Like to think, housing should be a basic human right. Not everyone needs that housing coupled with intensive services. So when we use the terms supportive housing, we're talking something that's it's permanent. There's a lease, so we're not talking about shelter. It's deeply affordable. So that means in the technical terms, people are paying no more than 30% of their income towards rent. And as I said, it's combined with support services. And if you're not familiar with the terms of housing first, that whole concept of, what is so critical to stabilizing someone experiencing chronic homelessness is having a place, a home, a roof over your head, and then starting to address other issues. And that's the concept. You start with housing. That's what comes first. You don't place lots of compliance requirements on people, like you must get sober, you must take these steps, but you do place basic tenancy requirements. You're going to have a lease. You need to abide by your lease. Your services are voluntary, but the focus is you need to be a good tenant. It doesn't mean you have to be a good, quote, client. So that real quickly, are some of the concepts, housing first. Example, one of the programs we had helped launch a number of years ago, and how, a room can save a life. Turning to what we do. So there kind of are four pillars, I would say, of what we do, and probably what we're going to want to focus on the most is that advocacy work, that policy work. So in preparing for this, I know we wanted to talk a little, like, there's something called the Supportive Housing Pipeline Coalition that we are one of the kind of lead organizations of. And that's bringing together, it's about 80 housing developers and other kinds of organizations around the state. We're calling for, like, what do we need to do to create more of a pipeline of this kind of supportive housing? And in this case, both to address for individuals and families who need this. And the goal is for us to get to 10,000 such units by the end of the decade. And let me just switch over. So there's a lot going on here, but basically, some of you may be aware the governor has called for, and the data is showing, we need to get to 200,000 more housing units by the end of the decade, just across any income category. And we are saying of that pool, we want to see 10,000 of them deeply affordable, coupled with these services as supportive housing. And let me see if I switch back, and that switched okay. Sometimes you have to stop the share and reshare. I'm going to assume it did. The other thing to touch on with folks is maybe hearing about the housing bond bill, the Affordable Homes Act. This is something the governor proposed back a couple of months ago. It's now making its way through the legislature. If everything makes its way through by this summer, this will be the largest bond bill in history and the kind of biggest state public policy effort to address our housing needs in 40 years. And I will just jump over for a moment. Let me see. Oh, that was the, well, sorry, let me go move this. Okay, so just a few points. The bond bill, $4 billion. There's a lot going on here, but it's basically $4 billion is being proposed as an investment in affordable housing, and that's of a whole variety. This would be, if passed, twice the size of any previous bond bill. There's a whole number of policy initiatives in it, and happy to chat about that. Much of it relates to what just general affordable housing in general, beyond homelessness, accessory dwelling units, transfer fee, etc. In this bond bill, though, as well, there is language about creating a mechanism to help bring together capital, operating, and services to be able to do supportive housing. So I'm going to jump back to the other slides I was showing you. And then, but again, I'll run through a few more, but then at any point, happy to chat more about the Pipeline Coalition, the bond bill, and any questions you have beyond that. So a few other things about my organization. So I said our work is advocacy policy. We also actually get money out the door to help fund supportive housing as an intermediary, and Home and Health for Good is a longstanding kind of flagship effort of ours. It's state funding that then goes out and fills budget gaps to help create and sustain supportive housing. That's one example of what we do there. We also pride ourselves on trying to be an innovator and a catalyst and test out new models and things. So one thing we've been involved in and growing in recent years is something called master leasing. So in a very tight, competitive housing market, even if someone has the funding, like you may be familiar, like a Section 8 housing voucher, and goes to a landlord, it's very hard to find a place where you can rent. Then if you were to add to it, you're someone who's really struggling on the margins, experiencing long-term homelessness, you're not the most desirable tenant in a tough market like this. What master leasing does is, in our case, our organization or others, they step forward, they enter a lease with a large or small scale property owner, and then sublease the units to the tenants. And when we do this, we're doing it in partnership with agencies that are members who provide supportive services. It's often very attractive to property owners because you got one lease, you're guaranteeing the rent, even if there are vacancies, we deal with that. So it's just one of the kind of tools in the toolbox in a tough market. And, example, we are involved in 200 master leasing of 223 units, greater Boston area, and have added 100 such units in the last 18 months. So again, effective thing to do in this tough housing market. And then finally, we are a convener. We do trainings, conferences, networking among our members, and heads up if there are those who are interested, we're kind of rolling out a permanent supportive housing learning forum with partners that will happen this spring, in-person conference, and then whole virtual training series to kind of help develop the sector and help both emerging and established developers. What else? Another person who is living in supportive housing. And then I guess just, finally, what can you do, like all of us? There's the basics of how do we all just recognize people's humanity when we are experiencing, see people out on the streets. We talk about ways to get involved. Happy to talk about information, movies, books like Evicted, excuse me. Fix that. That's Evicted. And homelessness is a housing problem. Happy to share others and just getting engaged in advocacy. And then, if you wanted to connect with us, and then my information. So I ran through things pretty quickly because, again, I wanted to not be talking at you. And just stop there, open it up, questions, stuff you'd like me to go back and explain in more detail.
If I may, I have a question about, please raise your hand and I can, I will invite you. And thank you, Joyce, for your presentation. And I know this is meant to be a conversation and not a presentation. I have a couple questions myself. And also before we start that, I wanted to note to the audience that in the chat, there is a form where you can fill in your CU units. So you can open the chat and download and use that as well. So back to the questions, Joyce. So you mentioned very briefly about part of the bill where there's money allocated to go back in and renovate some of our state housing buildings that were really in a bad shape from the 60s and the 70s. Could you elaborate a little bit on that? Is there a process? Is there RFPs going out or anything of that sort?
So I think what you may be referring to, so in that $4 billion bond bill package, and that would just get the authorization for the bonding, the authority to, there is funding that would be targeted to renovations of our state public housing.
Mm-hmm.
We are one of the only states that has a whole inventory of state-funded public housing as opposed to federal. There's both in this state. But unfortunately, yes, years and years of neglect has meant that a lot of that housing is in decline, and worse yet, like units getting mothballed and all because they're in such bad shape. I can try to find, that is not my area of expertise, but it is bundled into the bond bill.
Is any of this housing, sorry, is any of this housing, because I sit on the selection committee and we see these buildings and I wonder, are some of them geared to solve the homeless problem? Like some of them may be renovated to give you those 10,000, is it 10,000 units?
10,000 units by the end of the 2030. I mean, they could be. They're not. So public housing is such an important resource and benefits, there can be people coming out of homelessness who will be able to get units. Typically, public housing authorities are not necessarily like creating specialized supportive housing targeted people experiencing homelessness. That's typically, now, we partnered with the Worcester Housing Authority and they recently opened a very attractive project that is targeted to 22 people who have exited chronic homelessness. That's separate from their like traditional housing stock, but it's on land. I can quickly tell you. So here, I will show this. And again, this isn't my area, but it is in the, these are from slides that the state shared around overview of public housing. So the last bill, 2018, helped renovate 650 units. They're proposing, 150 million for decarbonization, another 50 million, like these upgrades that will benefit 1,600 units.
Mm-hmm. That's pretty good. That's pretty nice.
Yeah. I mean, I think the good news there is after like kicking the can down the road year after year, finally it's general agreement we have to invest in our public housing.
Does anyone have any questions from the audience or comments at this moment? Go ahead, Greta. I see your hand, and Bill also.
Looking for the icon, the thing. Well, I was interested that you mentioned this bill, this housing bill, and I just became aware of it recently because I'm also involved in a group called the Massachusetts Association for the Chemically Injured, who looks out for the interests of people who are chemically sensitive. And I guess it had never occurred to me, but a number of people become homeless because they just can't tolerate the chemicals or whatever the indoor environmental quality is in housing that's available to them. And I saw on that chart that you just showed a line item for recognizing the vulnerable populations.
Yeah. I can show that again for a moment. So, I can't speak to this with great authority because these are like the housing livable communities, this is their slide. These are their slides. I do know, so this is, I think you're referring to the vulnerable populations part. They have like different buckets within the bond bill to address different things. It's not like they're creating just a general fund of money that will create a variety of kinds of housing for people with disabilities. I think here's where they're just tallying their different buckets and what that adds up to.
Our organization just signed a testimony, or the president of MHSA suggesting that there should be a commission on for vulnerable disabilities, for affordable housing for people with disabilities. And so that seems like, I sort of did a little research online, and there are various organizations, everything from the Access Board and their regulations for building design to a registry of housing that's supposed to be, and there were a couple other organizations, but it seemed logical that there should be a commission that would sort of bring those people together and say, are we really addressing this? And I guess what you're saying also is just because it's a line item on that chart doesn't mean that someone is shepherding it and making sure. So that's what we
Or it doesn't mean like it's already very targeted. They have certain plans and populations is what I mean. Yeah.
I see. Yeah. See, the difficulty with people who are chemically sensitive is I know that maybe I'm mildly chemically sensitive. I used to have a problem with the perfumes that people would wear, and I couldn't tolerate. So that's how I got interested in this whole issue. But there are people who just the off-gassing from the polymers in grout in tile even, is an issue. And I guess because I have this tiny bit of this, I tend to believe them. A lot of people just say, oh, you're just complaining, you're oversensitive, but it will give some people
a lot of toxic stuff in our environment. It's hard to believe it's not having some impact. Yeah.
One thing I think would be really crucial to that issue is just to make sure that units are well sealed, have good air sealing, air barriers between them. Because if you have no smoking allowed, for instance, in these units, but if someone were doing something that was causing an odor, and the natural sort of ventilation through cracks in the building allows that to get into other people's units. Anyway,
I should make another comment on when we're talking about supportive housing, that can be a whole variety of things. It could be units out in the community, but where someone is a provider, like a case manager comes regularly to meet with someone, but it's just a unit rented in the community that's fully subsidized. It can be a building where there are a whole bunch of units, everyone living together. So there's quite a variety of models. I think, Bill, did you have a question?
Hi, yes, I did. My name's Bill Jacob. I'm from Jones Architecture in Salem, Mass. And I think a colleague of mine, Mary, is actually on the call too. Joyce, what you were saying right there kind of dovetails into my question. So Mary and I have been working on assisting the Lynn Shelter Association on renovating their shelter space for the better part of 5 years. And I guess my biggest question is about a time period where we were not so much involved, but in terms of procuring space for the needed program requirements and for housing new facilities to meet their needs, it seems like some of the spaces that the shelter had to look at were disadvantaged to start with, and they weren't the best building types to facilitate this type of program. The space that they're currently in is the basement of a post office building. It's terribly aged. It receives a lot of floodwaters. It's just not fit for any person to be within. But when it came time to start searching for building types to house this new program, there just weren't many options. And ultimately, they landed on repurposing the ground floors of a couple of existing buildings in their portfolio. I still think we can do a fantastic job helping them, but I guess given this imposed deadline of 10,000 units by the end of 2030 and beyond already allocated state provided housing, are there other opportunities? It seems like, back to your point about building types, it seems like there's some good typologies out there, schools, hotels, things that have been abandoned or have been aged out, but have the infrastructure to support multiple kind of single occupancy units. So my question, I guess, in that roundabout way is, how do you procure those building types and how do they become available for repurpose?
Sure. Yeah. So, and also just so a couple of things, if I understand it, I believe, if I understand it from Lynn's Shelter Association, what they are doing now is trying to find space to expand or change their shelter as opposed to housing, right? And just to comment on that, and then I'll turn to the second part, our goal was like, how do we get out of adding and expanding shelters? Because shelter, I've been in this work a long time, 30 years ago when I started, it's like, oh yeah, people are homeless. Let's build shelters. And lo and behold, 30 years later, the shelters are still like, we just don't get out of it, right? We absolutely have to, number one, be producing a lot more housing. So that's just, the editorial comment, but I'm aware, unfortunately, because housing production is so costly and takes so long to do, we're kind of in a very tough bind around the homelessness crisis. But so I want to note that. But then turning to, well, where is there opportunity around creating housing? At the moment it is, there's opportunity, like there are convents closing, parochial schools we're hearing about, nursing homes, these nursing homes that can't meet, they're kind of the old style rest homes and a little bit beyond, who aren't able to survive in their licensing world. That could be a perfect fit to repurpose as supportive housing, especially as kind of individual, units for single adults. Certainly we have been in conversation with the state about this. Unfortunately, I don't think that the state has said, like, come to us with your projects. Hotels, right? There are a couple of hotel conversion projects, and be happy to talk about them. Unfortunately, the state is not going to step forward and say, hey, let's inventory everything that's out there in the private market that's going bankrupt, and connect people to them so we can, so part of it is the state doesn't see that as its role. I think the other thing, unfortunately, as I mentioned, I alluded to, they've been hit by this humanitarian migrant crisis. It is taken up like all the bandwidth. So it has become hard to have them also focus on some of these other strategies. In the meantime, we are kind of trying to do what we can, as we can identify properties and connect people to them.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I should have had the caveat that the idea is that there's a transitional series of properties, SROs above that. Obviously, there's just such an influx of homelessness that you can't begin to shoulder it all. But the idea is to wean people out of that state if they can and transition to more permanent housing, which they do facilitate above. But those are excellent thoughts.
Yes,
Thanks for.
Yes, absolutely. And just so folks who were a couple of newer models, and I see the comment in the chat, and I'll get to that. Father Bill's in Mainspring and Quincy, and now in Brockton, and clinical support options out in Greenfield are green models where they're doing a kind of a little mini campus that has emergency shelter and supportive housing. And, having, like in Quincy, the model is a housing resource center. So it's a place where people in the community can come for emergency help around housing issues. And there's the shelter in that building and a medical respite. And right next door, there's housing. So those are, but it's, they take some money to create, and political will and all.
And this, I just wanted to, by the way, Bill and Mary, which office are you with, if you don't mind?
We're with Jones Architecture out of Salem, Mass.
Jones Architecture, thank you.
Sure.
I was just going to say too that model of Father Bill's is very unique. It's, I think it's haven't been done yet, but it's an experiment of having, it's how sort of individual transfer from emergency to housing. They have it all on the same site with the support, with the resources. So the only thing about it, it's not in the city. And we know this population loves to be in the city. However, they are seeing people who are enjoying that site, and we did a session on that project. So it's showing signs. Yeah, it's showing signs of good good solution, like as a campus. So
well, I have to say, I worked at Father Bill's as we were in the early days of planning for that. At the time when we visited some of the others. So out in Western Mass, in fairness to them, in Springfield, they really did the first kind of version of this. I would say the Father Bill's version is like the next level up. But okay. Out in Springfield, they do have a kind of campus that's shelter, day center, housing, all on one. And now they're replicating that in Greenfield, and similarly, Father Bill's is replicating their model in Brockton. And I will put in a plug. I mentioned one of the things that my organization, MHSA, does is we're the intermediary on funding, and we have gotten funding into all of these projects. It's sort of like flexible money that can help cover everything from pre-development to development to just every year ongoing operating and services. Because we know having that flexible funding is so critical to the success of these projects. And I noticed in the chat Rebecca's comment mentioning convents. So she's working on a supportive housing project in an old convent.
Hi.
I don't know if you want to.
Hi, Rebecca.
Hi.
You want to?
Hi. So I'm a landscape architect, but I'm working with a neighborhood development corporation in South Boston, and they bought a convent that had been used for a couple of years by another nonprofit, and they just couldn't use it anymore. So they put out an RFP looking for someone that would keep the historic building And so we're working on that right now. I'm putting in our application for the supportive housing funding round. And so like it's eligible through the state one-stop
Yep.
programs. Great. And so there are options like that if people maybe want to team up with, or like if you're working with a shelter, maybe get them to team up with another community development corporation or NDC, because they seem to also be doing those and just kind of keeping them in their portfolios with other, you know, this one in particular, the South Boston one, has some supportive housing or different types of housing for our veterans or seniors. And it's all like their entire portfolio, I think, is affordable housing. But they do have some specialized different types.
Nice.
I don't know if they have any that are, I heard the sensitivity, the chemical sensitivity comments, which was really interesting, but I know like the new building at the convent, there'll be an addition behind it, and that's going to be passive house. So that would address a lot of the chemical concerns.
And then I know, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to see, where's the passive house project behind?
The one at the convent, it's in South Boston.
South
Boston. Convent in South Boston. So it'll be passive house.
Nice. Sorry, Joyce, go.
You mentioned in your comments about, so the roadway apartments, Father Bill's Mainspring developed those in Brockton. We have helped providing now ongoing support in that project. Okay. We've also been very involved in a hotel conversion project in Worcester that's in process. So there's, let's see, there's the Brockton, there's Worcester, there's one in Hadley. And then
that's great. It seems like the hotels would offer a nice kind of box to start with, but you know, like the convent too, similarly, it was like nice little cells, the small rooms that a convent or seminary would have, you know, kind of was a good format.
I mean, the state is still very interested in any hotel conversion projects, and theory, if there are places that have them, they will do their best to fast track those projects.
That's great.
Yeah, we had kind of hoped during the pandemic to get a whole lot more of them, but there's some.
I know, I keep thinking, I live in Dedham and there's one that looks like it's empty, or I don't know if it's just getting renovated, but I'm like, what can we build?
Yeah.
Come on now.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I don't need to probably tell you the whole issue of zoning and local opposition. I mean, Pines, if anyone's followed it, Pine Street Inn is converting what was the Comfort Inn on Marcy Boulevard in Dorchester. I mean, they were just put through hell, but the project is going to be happening. I mean, it was really like older people who've come out of homelessness, and it's like right on Marcy Boulevard, but yeah, they had a lot of opposition.
Frustrating.
And Joyce, when you say we helped with this project, or we helped with, you know, like you talked about the Father Bill, and when you say we helped, is that funding, or is that a support in terms of knowledge or management?
Yeah, it can mean a few things. So, you know, I ran through our slides. So one of our programs, the Home and Healthy for Good, we're actually the intermediary of funding. And another thing we're doing in partnership with United Way and Corporation for Supportive Housing, which is national, is it kind of happened, if folks followed ARPA funding, it came out at the tail end of the pandemic. Anyway, the legislature, we were the intermediary of $15 million there. But so in both of these buckets of money, we're going to get money into projects a little faster than sometimes the state is able to do. Sometimes into projects that might be smaller, that the state, you know, is going to be lower on the state's list. So that's why some of the hotel projects, we were like directly getting money into them. And we're also testing and demonstrating when you have flexible money. So it's Home and Healthy for Good. It's like, okay, year one, the money used towards pre-development. Year 2 and 3 fills a gap in the development budget. Years 4 and thereafter fills a gap in the operating and support budget. So it might only be, you know, like in the Worcester Hotel, I forget off the top of my head, things like $250,000 a year. But when you know you're going to have that year after year, that can be kind of critical kind of support. So that's a key piece of something that my organization does. We also will at times be involved in actually helping with technical assistance and planning. You know, like, oh, Hadley, you're thinking about doing this. Well, Father Bill's did a similar project in Brockton. Let me connect you to them, or let me give you an entree to certain people in state government about funding to help cover your services. Or in the case of Worcester, like we actually were part of an ongoing planning meetings, how to kind of build a coalition of support. So different roles that we might play.
That's a lot. That's a lot of work. Anybody else have any questions or had their hand raised? I'm not sure if we missed anyone in the chat. There was a comment. Okay, this was about the credit. And the other question I had is about the coalition that you mentioned. And I saw the slide and there are like a lot of collaborators, if you will, or and I was wondering if you can elaborate a little bit more. I know you mentioned developers are part of the mix, and how does that work also for architects to understand?
Yeah, so I'm just going to screen share this slide one more time. And this is really just a sample of the places that are the entities that are part of this coalition. But it gives you a sense, so you have like in communities, they're a large developer of affordable housing, or OA, another large developer of affordable housing. United Healthcare, why are they interested? Because they chronic homelessness is very costly in terms of healthcare costs. We're working very closely with them on like how can we create some models for medically complex people that can get them into housing and reduce those like in and out of emergency rooms and acute care. Some of the other larger organizations, Father Bill's Mainspring, we mentioned, they're doing that, the hotel project on Brockton. So it's quite, and many of us who are part of, statewide organizations. So this is really just a sample. Among the things that we've been trying to do with the coalition is really bring the more traditional affordable housing sector developers to the table and almost have some more marriages of folks who create supportive housing for people coming out of homelessness. I will say, having been in this work a very long time, it used to be like those of us that were running shelters and said, well, no one's creating the right housing for some of our most complex people. Okay, we'll do it. And, that's kind of how Pine Street started their housing. It's like, all right, we'll just do it. And, if you listen to them today, they will say like, we can no longer do it that way, where we just like buy a house and turn it into 10 units of housing. It's like, how do we scale this stuff up? And to do that effectively, we really need the partnerships with a much larger developers of affordable housing. Having said that, there's still going to be projects, like we invested in a project in North Adams for young adults experiencing homelessness. It's a house for 12 people. And, we're not going to get a big time developer doing that. So then we really do need a range.
Yeah, I think bringing the developers to the mix is so crucial, especially for the city of Boston, where the land is really high in cost. But those partnerships of where the city owns some lands, under a highway, next to a highway, whatever, or abandoned lots or lot that's in between, or like you talked about zoning a little bit, changing the zoning. If we can bring the help of developers, private developers into the mix to give them incentive in taxes or what have you, that could be another way to help to create these 10,000 units by 2020, which is only 6 years. Anyway, we have a question or a comment from Eric. Eric, would you like to speak to it, or would you like me to read it?
Oh, well, you could read it.
Yeah.
I think I'm just musing about whether the recent legislation we might expect that to help in any way.
I mean, right, the MBTA communities and the multi-family zoning law. I mean, hopefully it will help. I mean, I think to be very blunt, in the pecking order of types of affordable housing. Supportive housing, especially when talking supportive housing for people who've experienced homelessness, chronic homelessness, that's like, in terms of politically what is appealing to communities or not, like that's very low on their list. To jump back to what among the things we're doing with the Supportive Housing Pipeline Coalition. So there is our work to broaden the sector. There is also work we're partnering with a national organization called The Case Made. And they really are taking some of the tools from kind of public relations, advertising, and how do you use them in your community process to try to win communities over to support supportive housing. In fact, we're about to roll out a training series with some communities to do that. So that's some of the long answer. Short answer, we hope it's going to help. I mean, all of these are important tools. And I will, just going back to Supportive Housing Pipeline Coalition, I will put in a plug. If you are at all interested, you want to learn more, how can you take part? Please reach out to me. I'm happy to get you connected. Our partners at United Way sort of serve as the key staffers to this, but be great to have more architects involved. We're really trying to kind of broaden this coalition.
That's good to hear. And James, you have a comment? Please go ahead. Do you want to share with us?
Yes. I had the opportunity a couple of years ago to work on some of the preliminary designs for Father Bill's in Quincy. And I thought it was a terrific program, and I was definitely a fan of their model and what they were trying to do. But I don't see a lot of that elsewhere. Many times it is just a shelter, or it's something that seems far more temporary than that. And the other thing that I see is a lot of the public. I mean, whether I'm standing in line somewhere, whether I'm in the barber's chair, whether it's wherever I am, and they talk about homelessness as, well, I don't want them dumped here.
Yeah.
Why do we have to have them here? What do we, it's like, and I don't think a lot of people understand that there's more to this than just having more shelters. All these initiatives and having this housing, and what that could really do to actually start to, I don't know if we'll ever completely eliminate it, but to help eliminate the homeless problem. And it's like, what is being done as far as kind of general education to the public so that they can get behind this? Because, and I have to admit, prior to working with Father Bill's, I didn't know a whole lot about it. And I think it really did change my perception. Once they started going through the program of what they do, I was like, really?
Yeah.
And I was like, why aren't we doing more of that?
Yeah. Yeah, really important points. I mean, I confess, if we had a really good PR budget, we could do all kinds of educational PR campaigns. Some of what's tricky, so, I hear from colleagues, like I was talking to colleagues up in Lowell who said, it's getting even harder now to cite supportive housing. Why? Because people are afraid of mass and Cass, right? So people have heard about mass and Cass in Boston, and they think, oh my gosh, this epicenter, this kind of craziness, it's going to come to our community. And, part of what's frustrating is so everything under the sun gets called homelessness. When we talk about mass and Cass, we really have a whole number of things coming together, right? I mean, we know in this country, we have this massive drug epidemic. And, as I talk with folks who are much more engaged around mass and Cass than I am, sadly, a lot of it was an open air drug market. And a lot of the people experiencing homelessness, were scared to stay there. Mm-hmm. Some were, but, there was only a subset, how do you tease out what is people who do not have a place to live from predatory drug dealing activity? how do we chill out? We have a broken mental health system. You know, why is it that if you have a major brain disorder, such as like, you know, schizophrenia, we feel it's okay for you to live on the street? And we call it homelessness. So we do have this challenge that like so many things have now been defined under homelessness.
I agree. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I do. I agree with you also. I perceive a lot of people, anybody who doesn't have somewhere to live is just lumped into this undesirable category, quite frankly. And yeah.
I think what we wrestle with for those of us working in this sector, this like, how much do we do via public education? So I mentioned about this, the case made and how they do more effective kind of PR around addressing the stigma of homelessness. I mean, you're not going to turn around the haters, right? But just to raise greater. And the other argument is like, we got to go after this as a fair housing issue. You know, if we're talking about supportive housing for people who have significant disabilities, why do you get to say, oh, I don't want you in my neighborhood? I don't want you in my town. So those are like the two sides of the, how do we address this? You know, education versus, you know, someone said, how do you make supportive housing by right?
Yeah, I think I think you just said it. That's right where the problem is. And a lot of towns are struggling with that. Chelsea, I think, is one of them, from neighbors. And then the island out there, they don't want to rebuild the bridge. They don't want anybody to pass through. I mean, there are examples of that happening every day.
Well, I want to just give a shout out to the city of Chelsea. We work closely with them. We have a very close partnership. You heard I mentioned about master leasing. We're the partner on a couple of projects there. And it just, you know, this is like every now and then you get like, it all comes together nicely. It's rare, but every now and then. And they're like, the city was a really good partner. A local developer born and raised in Chelsea purchased what had been the old Chelsea YMCA. We were at the time able to get the funding to help with some of the renovation. We brought in Bay Cove Human Services as a service partner, you know, and it's now 52 renovated, both single rooms and some studios for men, staff on site. There's 24/7 staffing, offices on site. And now that same developer bought the place next door and we developed it for women. You know, 16 units. Now he's looking at the other one across the street. So, you know, sometimes when you kind of get these things coming together, you can really make some headway. I would say Father Bills has been able, you know, I think you were saying, James, like you're not seeing in other places. It's true. Like some places where you've had really great leadership and you start to get some momentum and you start to build the capacity, you see kind of, you're able to make some headway. And, you know, we've got some work to do in some other communities.
I just did a little calculation. It's 10,000 units. I'm not sure where that how anyone came up with that number, but there are 300. I divided by the number of municipalities in Massachusetts, and I came up with, then we need 28.5 units per
if you did it
municipality. However, there's Boston, and then there's some little village out in the Berkshires. So, so you could, you know, prorate it by the population of the town, but it, you know, it becomes a little bit more manageable to think that it's not, if all the municipalities in Massachusetts participated, then it wouldn't be crazy.
Yeah. So quick thing on the number. So we spent about 2 years on this. So one of the things we're doing through this coalition is like, well, if we want to plan a pipeline of supportive housing for this targeted group, don't we need to know how many people are in that targeted group, their inflow and their outflow, where are they? And then also, what is our current inventory? So it took us 2 years to finally get permission from the state to start to share data So we're just getting there. So this is what was happening. Everyone says like, well, what's the number of units we need? It's like, well, we need to know the population that we're doing. So I confess, when we came up with 10,000, it was based on very rough data. We're finally getting better data. We're pleased to see it's pretty, similar to what we had suspected is needed. At the moment, there is inventory of about 10,000 units existing of what we call this supportive housing across the state, this particular kind. But it's only increasing by, like 800 units a year. So we obviously would have to dramatically accelerate that. But that's the other thing. There's a lot of work on the data side, right? Because to do effective planning, we need to know what are the numbers we're dealing with.
Yeah, just like any other project, you need to know your program, right? Otherwise, how are you going to fund it and plan for it and solve it?
Right. So it's been an interesting process. And, we're now meeting regularly with the state, and they want to work with us on how do we get to and use our data more effectively to do better planning.
That's nice. That's good to hear. Very encouraging. When we started this roundtable, I think it was 2 years ago, I think that's when data was kind of in question, whether through the federal or through the state, and you guys were just starting to get through it. And we kept asking, well, what do you need? What do you need? It's like, we don't know yet. Does anyone have any more questions or comments? We're getting close to the hour. Any final thoughts? Joyce, anything you'd like to leave us with?
Well, if you want to, feel free to share the slides that I gave you if people are interested. Just, I'm, happy to be a resource. If you have questions, you want to join the Supportive Housing Pipeline Coalition, you want to learn more about MHSA, we're just eager. Mark Margulies, a kind of well-known Cambridge architect, worked with us in a partnership on, the concept of modular micro unit housing. And, we partnered with him on how do we promote that model to the state. So we're very interested in opportunities for partnerships with architects and others in the housing sector.
And there is an RFP out through the city about this 2 lots, empty lots in Roxbury, I believe. And I don't know if it closed the deadline. I think it's pretty soon, and it requires a developer. I just shared my email in case you want to connect and also get the information that Joyce has been talking about. And I want to thank everyone for your time and attending. And let's keep the conversation going. And please, if you have any projects, James, Bill, Rebecca, Eric, that you want to share with in this forum with other architects, just to raise more awareness about this typology, which at least in my experience is not fairly shared, and architects are not all aware of it. So Joyce, thank you so much for your time and for your hard work, and we wish you the best continuing what you're doing.
Thank you.
The organization. Appreciate. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Yeah. Bye-bye.